The old man's hands trembled as he reached toward the rusted wire fence, eyes fixed on the shadows that flickered between the trees. A faint whimper broke the stillness of the cold evening, barely more than a breath, but it was enough. Enough to pull him from his chair by the hearth, enough to stir something long buried within his heart. The forest beyond the clearing was thick with mist, tendrils curling like silent fingers around the gnarled branches. The scent of damp earth and pine needles hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint coppery tang of something else. Something wrong. Arthur had lived in this remote village for nearly 60 years, a quiet man known more for his stubborn solitude than for kindness. Yet tonight, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a dull orange glow across the worn wooden planks of his porch, he felt a tug he couldn't ignore. The whimper came again, more desperate this time, threading its way through the hush that settled over the land like a shroud. His breath caught, clouding in the chill as he stepped outside, the worn leather of his boots crunching over frost-nipped grass. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy, but tonight the silence seemed too complete, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. There was something beneath that fragile sound, a plea, a warning, a secret waiting to be unearthed. His eyes darted to the darkened tree line where the moonlight struggled to pierce the canopy. A flicker of movement, barely discernible, sent a shiver down his spine. The old stories whispered by the village elders, tales of creatures lurking at the edge of sight, surfaced unbidden. Arthur shook his head, trying to dismiss the shadows, but the pull remained. A low, ragged growl cut through the night, closer now, trembling with fear or pain. His heart thundered in his chest, a discordant rhythm that matched the wild beat of the unknown. Something was out there, something hurt, something hiding, and despite the years of caution, despite the loneliness that had carved itself deep into his bones, Arthur took a step forward, toward the dark, toward the unknown, because some secrets refused to stay buried in silence. Arthur's breath hitched as he crossed the threshold, the crisp night air folding around him like a shroud of memories and regrets. The village behind his weathered home lay silent, its thatched roofs and crooked chimneys swallowed by the looming forest's edge. Decades had passed since his youth, when laughter echoed through these streets and neighbors exchanged stories by firelight. Now time had settled over the hamlet like a slow fog, muting voices and dimming the warmth that once thrived here. He paused, the rough wood of the porch railing rough beneath his calloused palms, and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The trees stood as ancient sentinels, their limbs tangled and knotted, weaving a tapestry of shadow and moonbeam. Somewhere in the depths, the faint whimper returned, fragile and fractured, an aching thread he couldn't ignore. It stirred something within Arthur, a tenderness long buried beneath years of solitude and silent endurance. A lifetime in this village had taught him the language of silence. He knew the weight of unspoken grief, the ache of old wounds left to fester in the dark. His own story was etched into the lines on his face and the stoop of his shoulders. Widowhood had come quietly, like the slow fading of light at dusk, leaving him a solitary figure against the vastness of the wilderness. His children had long since moved away, chasing dreams beyond the forest's grasp, leaving behind only echoes and empty rooms. Yet, despite the ache of loss, Arthur remained tethered to this patch of earth by roots deeper than he dared admit. The forest was more than trees and shadows. It was a living archive of his past, a repository of moments both tender and tragic. Tonight, that past whispered to him, carried on the fragile breath of a wounded creature hidden just beyond sight. The whimper shifted, closer now, threaded with pain and fear. Arthur's heart tightened, a slow, steady pulse beneath the cold surface of his skin. He stepped down from the porch, boots sinking slightly into the frost-hardened earth. The chill bit at his cheeks, but he hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the skein of memory and hope. As he ventured deeper toward the tree line, the forest seemed to hold its breath with him. The scent of pine mingled with the damp musk of decaying leaves, and somewhere far off, the faint rustle of a small creature fleeing into the underbrush. His fingers brushed against the rough bark of a tree, grounding him in the moment, anchoring him to the here and now. For a flicker of time, he allowed himself to feel the pulse of life beneath his fingertips, a reminder that even in the darkest places, something fragile endured. Arthur's thoughts drifted to the old legends whispered by the village elders, stories of wolves that roamed beneath the moon's cold gaze, guardians of secrets and shadows. He had always dismissed them as tales to frighten children, but tonight, those tales felt less like myth and more like a warning. The forest was no longer just a backdrop to his solitude. It was a stage where something unseen played out in silence. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flicker of grey fur beneath a thicket of brambles. His breath caught, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and compassion. He crouched low, careful not to startle whatever creature lay hidden. The whimper grew more urgent, a soft, ragged sound that spoke of pain and desperation. Arthur's mind raced, torn between the instinct to flee and a deep-seated need to help. He remembered the nights spent nursing his late wife through illness, the quiet vigils held in the dim glow of candlelight. The tender care he had given then now extended beyond human bounds, reaching out to this wounded presence cloaked in fur and fear. Yet, beneath that impulse to aid, a flicker of unease stirred. What was this creature hiding? What truth lay beneath the trembling form shrouded in shadow? Arthur's fingers trembled as he reached forward, a hesitant gesture born of kindness and fear. The forest held its breath with him, the silence thick and expectant. Somewhere deep inside, a storm was gathering, a tumult of hope, doubt, and the fragile promise that sometimes even the loneliest hearts could find connection in the unlikeliest places. As the old man's eyes met the creature's, a secret long kept by the wilderness began to unravel, a secret that would shatter the quiet of the night and echo through the stillness of his soul. But for now, in the fragile balance between fear and compassion, Arthur simply held his breath and waited, the weight of the unknown pressing gently against his chest. Arthur's hand hovered mere inches from the trembling creature's fur, yet an inexplicable hesitation rooted him to the spot. The moonlight sifted through the branches, casting fractured silver patterns across the wolf's matted coat. Its eyes, wide and glistening with pain, locked onto his with an intensity that felt almost human, laden with unspoken pleas and something deeper, something that unsettled him beyond fear or pity. A flicker of doubt gnawed at Arthur's resolve. Why had the creature not fled when it had the chance? Why instead did it remain as if caught between flight and surrender? The old man's mind stumbled upon a fragment of a memory, not of the village, but of a moment long buried, an inexplicable encounter with a shadow in the forest, years ago, that had left him uneasy. The memory was hazy, distorted by time, but the feeling it carried was sharp. A warning whispered just beyond comprehension. Arthur's breath hitched, and he instinctively drew back, almost as if the wolf's gaze held a secret too dangerous to confront. Yet beneath that recoil, a stubborn thread of compassion pulled him forward again. His fingers brushed the coarse fur, cold and damp beneath his touch, and he felt a subtle tremor ripple through the creature's body, not just from pain, but from something else. Fear, certainly, but also a strange reluctance, an unspoken burden heavier than the wound itself. The wolf's breathing was shallow, ragged, each exhale a ragged whisper against the night air. Yet amid the pain, there was a flicker of awareness, a cautious intelligence that seemed to weigh Arthur's presence carefully. It was not the wild fear of an animal cornered, but a wary calculation, as if the wolf was silently questioning the old man's intentions, and perhaps his own. Arthur's eyes drifted to the patch of forest floor near the wolf, where the undergrowth had been disturbed. Leaves were scattered unevenly, crushed in a pattern that suggested a struggle, but something else caught his attention. Faint marks, almost like scratches, etched into the bark of a nearby sapling. Their jagged edges looked recent, but there was something unnatural about their arrangement, too deliberate, too precise for a mere animal's panic. He knelt slowly, his knees creaking in protest, and traced the marks with a trembling finger. An uneasy chill crept along his spine, as if the forest itself had imprinted a secret warning. Arthur's heart thudded louder, not from fear, but from the sudden surge of a question that unsettled everything he thought he knew about these woods. What was the meaning of these marks? Were they a sign, a message, or something darker? A cipher left by a presence unseen. The wolf shifted beneath his hand, a low growl rumbling in its throat, not threatening but wary, laden with a cautious plea. Arthur's gaze flicked back to its eyes, searching for a clue hidden beneath the layers of pain and mistrust. There was an intelligence there, yes, but also a flicker of something else, desperation or perhaps resignation. The creature seemed to carry a secret it dared not reveal, something that weighed heavier than its wounds. A faint rustle broke the silence, a sound so subtle it might have been imagined. Arthur's senses sharpened, every nerve alert to the forest's shifting breath. Somewhere beyond the trees, a shadow detached itself from the darkness, moving with a predator's grace. Arthur's pulse quickened, a mixture of dread and curiosity knotting in his chest. Was this watcher friend or foe? Protector or threat? The uncertainty gnawed at him, deepening the web of tension that ensnared the night. Arthur's mind reeled with conflicting impulses. The instinct to flee warred with the need to stay, to understand, to help. Yet, beneath these surface tensions, there was a quieter, more insidious question. What if the creature was not what it seemed? What if the wolf's pain masked something more complex? A hidden truth that might unravel the fragile peace Arthur had clung to for decades. His fingers tightened their grip. A silent vow whispered through the cold night air. Whatever secret the wolf held, whatever shadow lurked beyond the trees, Arthur would face it, not as a man broken by solitude, but as one stirred by the fragile hope of connection. The forest seemed to lean closer, the mist curling tighter around the ancient trunks, wrapping the clearing in a cocoon of tense expectation. A sudden, sharp snap echoed, a branch fractured underfoot, and the wolf's ears twitched, head turning swiftly toward the sound. Arthur followed its gaze, heart pounding, but saw nothing beyond the shifting shadows. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, as if the forest itself waited for a revelation that neither man nor beast dared voice. Arthur's breath slowed, steadying in the cold air. The wolf's gaze met his once more, a flicker of recognition passing between them, fleeting, fragile, but unmistakable. In that moment, a fragile bridge formed across the gulf of fear and silence, a tentative promise that the night's secret might yet unfold, not in darkness, but in the quiet dawn of understanding. And as the cold mist thickened, Arthur knew the night was far from over. The forest held its secrets close, but he was no longer just an observer. He was part of the story now, a reluctant guardian of a mystery that would demand all of his courage, all of his heart. Arthur's fingers trembled as he slowly withdrew his hand from the wolf's fur, startled not by the creature itself, but by the sudden, sharp crack of a branch snapping beneath a heavy boot. His eyes darted upward, scanning the dense shadows beyond the thicket where the wolf lay wounded. The moonlight, pale and brittle, caught the glint of something metallic, an object partially concealed beneath a cluster of leaves, reflecting an eerie, unnatural gleam. Heart pounding, Arthur rose to his feet, every instinct screaming caution. The wolf's ragged breathing faltered as it turned its head toward the sound, ears pricked and body taut. The old man's gaze followed the glint, edging closer with a mixture of dread and determination. His breath came out in shallow puffs, mist curling into the cold night air like silent warnings. The forest around him hummed with an almost tangible tension, the quiet punctuated only by distant rustlings and the wolf's labored breaths. As Arthur crouched nearer, he uncovered the object fully, a small battered camera, its lens cracked, lying tangled in a snarl of branches and freshly disturbed earth. His brow furrowed deeply. This was no ordinary piece of lost equipment. The camera looked deliberately discarded, and the surrounding soil bore signs of hurried disturbance, as if someone had tried to hide it in haste. A sudden realization struck him. This was not a random encounter. Someone had been here before, lurking in the shadows of these woods, watching, perhaps even following the wolf. His mind raced back to the strange, deliberate scratches on the sapling, now illuminated in a new light. Signs not of natural panic, but markers, deliberate signals left by a human hand. Arthur's pulse quickened as the pieces clicked together. A hidden watcher, silent and unseen, had been tracking the wolf, but why? And what had drawn them to this wounded creature in the first place? The wolf shifted beneath him, a low, urgent growl rumbling from deep in its throat. Arthur's heart ached for the animal, caught not only in pain but now in the tangled web of human danger. As he reached to soothe the creature once more, a soft rustling echoed from deeper within the trees, a sound distinct from the earlier snap, lighter, more deliberate. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping cautiously into the clearing. A young woman, her clothes stained with mud and leaves, eyes wide and wary but burning with a fierce intensity. Arthur froze, unsure whether to greet or defend. The wolf's ears flattened, a warning growl vibrating beneath its breath. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said quickly, voice low but urgent. "Please, just stay calm." Arthur's gaze searched her face, etched with exhaustion, determination, and something else. A desperate hope. She took a cautious step closer, glancing briefly at the wounded wolf before meeting his eyes again. "My name's Emma," she said. "I've been tracking this wolf for weeks. It's not just any animal, it's part of something bigger." Arthur's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What's bigger than a wounded creature in the woods?" Emma swallowed hard, glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting unseen eyes to watch them still. "There's a group, scientists, environmentalists, even some local authorities, who've been studying the wolves here. But not all of them want to protect the animals. Some see them as a threat, something to be controlled or eliminated." Arthur felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The stories he had long dismissed, the whispered rumors of illegal trapping, of clandestine hunts under the cover of darkness, now seemed real, tangible, and horrifying. Emma's voice grew quieter but no less urgent. "This wolf, it's one of the last from a pack that's been disappearing. Injuries like this don't just come from the wild. Someone's been hunting them, trying to send a message." Arthur's mind reeled. The wolf's cautious stare, the hidden camera, the deliberate marks on the trees, all pieces of a puzzle now forming a grim picture of human cruelty and secrecy. The forest was no longer merely a place of solitude and whispered legends. It was a battleground for survival and hidden agendas. "How long have you known about this?" Arthur asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "Long enough to know I can't do this alone," Emma replied, her eyes pleading. "I was following this wolf when it got hurt. I think it might have stumbled into a trap, one set by people who want to keep the wolves out of this land for good." Arthur's heart tightened. The weight of decades of quiet isolation suddenly felt fragile against the storm of truth unraveling before him. Here, in the shadowed woods he had called home, a darker reality pulsed beneath the surface, one that demanded action, courage, and perhaps sacrifice. He glanced at the wolf again, its breathing shallow but steady, eyes flickering with a trust that surprised him. This creature, so vulnerable and yet so fiercely alive, had become a symbol of something greater, a fragile hope amid the encroaching darkness. Arthur swallowed his fear. "We'll help," he said quietly, the words feeling both heavy and freeing. "But you need to tell me everything. No more secrets." Emma nodded, relief washing over her features. "There's more than you know, and the deeper we dig, the more dangerous it gets." The forest seemed to close in around them, the mist thickening as if to shield their whispered plans from prying eyes. The night had shifted, the fragile balance of solitude and mystery broken by a revelation that rippled through the stillness like a stone tossed into a pond. Arthur realized then that this night marked the beginning of a journey he had never imagined, a journey that would force him to confront not only the shadows of the forest, but the shadows within himself. The wolf's secret was no longer hidden beneath fur and fear. It was a call to arms, a summons to protect and to fight against a creeping threat that threatened the very soul of the land he loved. As Emma and Arthur prepared to move, the wolf stirred beneath his hand, its gaze steady and unwavering. In that silent exchange, an unspoken pact was forged, a promise that no matter how dark the path ahead, they would face it together. The forest held its breath once more, but this time Arthur knew he was no longer alone in the shadows. The old man who had lived in quiet solitude was now part of a living, breathing struggle, one that would test every ounce of his courage and compassion. And as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the horizon, the mystery of the wounded wolf unfolded into something far more urgent, far more real, and far more dangerous than Arthur had ever dared imagine. Arthur stood motionless for a long moment, the weight of Emma's words pressing down on him like the dense forest mist curling around their ankles. The camera, the marks on the trees, the wolf's wounds, they weren't random. They were evidence of something darker, something insidious hiding beneath the quiet surface of his lifelong home. A slow, tight knot formed in his stomach, twisting with a mixture of disbelief and raw, gnawing fear. His breath caught in his throat, cold air filling his lungs unevenly as his mind raced, grappling with the unthinkable. For decades, he had believed the forest to be a refuge, a sanctuary untouched by human cruelty, a place where time had softened the edges of pain. Now that illusion shattered, splintering into sharp shards of doubt and trembling uncertainty. The wolves weren't just wild animals, they were victims. And the forest, once a symbol of solitude and peace, had become a battleground. Arthur's gaze drifted back to the wolf lying quietly at his feet, its breathing fragile but steady. The creature's eyes met his again, half wild, half pleading, and he felt a strange ache blossom in his chest, compassion tangled with a burgeoning anger, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. How had he missed this? How had the cruelty hidden in plain sight for so long? His hands trembled as he reached down to brush a stray lock of fur away from the wolf's wounded flank. The fur was matted, sticky with dried blood, and beneath his fingertips, the roughness of the injury sent a shudder through him. A sudden, sharp sting of guilt pricked at his conscience. Years spent turning away, years spent wrapped in his own grief and isolation. Had his silence, his distance, become a form of complicity? Emma's presence beside him felt both comforting and unsettling, a young woman burdened with knowledge he had only just begun to grasp. He watched her closely, noting the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered to the shadows beyond the clearing as if expecting danger to leap from the trees at any moment. Her exhaustion was palpable, but so was her determination, flickering like a fragile flame against the night's cold. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Arthur admitted quietly, voice rough and low. "For a long time, I thought the forest was something I could understand, something I could control by staying out of its way. But now—" He trailed off, swallowing hard against the lump forming in his throat. Emma nodded slowly, her expression softening. "It's a lot to take in. I've been fighting this alone for so long, trying to protect them, but it feels like the odds keep stacking against us." Arthur's breath hitched again, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. His eyes flicked to the dense shadows, where the forest seemed to pulse with hidden life, watching, waiting. The weight of years pressed down on him, memories surfacing in fragments. Laughter shared long ago around village fires, the sound of his wife's voice fading into silence, the ache of empty rooms and forgotten promises. A sudden chill swept through the clearing, stirring the mist into ghostly shapes that danced around their feet. Arthur pulled his coat tighter, the fabric rough against his skin, grounding him. He realized how much he had been clinging to the past, to the comfort of routine and silence, even as the world shifted beneath his feet. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he whispered, almost to himself. "Why did I have to find out like this, alone in the dark, with a wounded wolf at my feet?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because some truths are hard to face. Because fear keeps people quiet. Because the village has its own shadows, and not everyone wants them brought to light." Arthur's fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. Anger flared, hot and sudden, a raw, fierce blaze against the cold night. He thought of the villagers he had known all his life, their cautious glances, the whispered warnings about the forest's dangers, the unspoken rules that kept everyone at a distance. Had they turned a blind eye? Had they chosen silence over courage? His eyes narrowed, scanning the flickering shadows as if searching for answers hidden in the darkness. The wolf shifted beneath his hand, a low rumble vibrating through its chest, not a growl, but a quiet call for trust. Arthur felt a strange kinship with this wounded creature, both of them bearing scars invisible to the world, both standing on the edge of an uncertain path. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him, the mist thickening into a curtain that blurred the line between what was known and what was feared. A distant owl's call echoed through the trees, a lonely sound that resonated deep within Arthur's chest. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to let the weight of the moment settle. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full measure of his vulnerability, the fear that comes not from the darkness outside, but from the truths lurking within. The fear of change, of loss, of stepping into a world where the rules were rewritten and the past no longer offered sanctuary. Emma's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "We can't undo what's been done," she said softly, "but maybe we can fight for what's left. Together." Arthur nodded, a fragile hope kindling amid the storm of his thoughts. The wolf's breathing deepened, a small sign of resilience, and the forest around them seemed to exhale in response, the mist parting like a veil lifted. He took a step closer to Emma, the distance between them shrinking as unspoken trust began to weave its delicate thread. The night was far from over, and the road ahead uncertain. But a shift had taken place, a breaking open of old wounds and the first stirrings of something new. Arthur's voice was barely more than a whisper as he spoke. "I don't know what comes next, but I know I can't turn away anymore." The silence that followed was heavy and full, a quiet acknowledgement that the world they had known was changing. The fragile bond between man and wolf, between old wounds and new resolve, was now the thread that tied them to a future neither could yet see. Outside the clearing, the forest stirred once more, ancient and watchful. And Arthur, the old man who had lived in shadows, felt the first flicker of light dawn within him, a light born not of certainty, but of the courage to face the darkness head-on. Arthur sat alone in the dim glow of his living room, the flickering fireplace casting shadows that danced like restless spirits across the walls. The silence was profound, yet within it a tempest brewed, a swirling eddy of emotions that churned beneath his skin, refusing to settle. The night's revelations clung to him like cold mist, seeping into every crevice of his being, unraveling the carefully woven fabric of his solitude. He traced the rim of a faded photograph resting on the worn oak table before him, fingers trembling as they brushed the glass. The image captured a younger version of himself, arms wrapped around his wife, her smile radiant against a backdrop of sunlit meadows. Time had etched lines into their faces, but the warmth captured in that frozen moment remained untarnished. Yet now, that warmth felt distant, like a fragile ember struggling against the encroaching chill of loss and silence. Arthur's breath hitched as memories surfaced unbidden, sharp and vivid. He remembered the soft weight of her hand in his during those long, sleepless nights, the whispered prayers that carried hope and fear in equal measure. He recalled the quiet conversations held in the dim light, words of love, of regret, of promises never fully kept. Those memories, once a sanctuary, now felt like ghosts, haunting the edges of his consciousness with their bittersweet ache. The weight of guilt settled heavily on his chest, a relentless pressure that constricted his breath. How had he allowed so much time to slip by, wrapped in his own grief, while the world around him shifted and darkened? The thought gnawed at him, a relentless question without answer. Had his retreat into silence been a shield or a cage? Was his solitude a sanctuary or a surrender? Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth, a reminder of the forest's quiet presence, eternal and watchful. The familiar sounds that once brought comfort now felt charged with meaning, as if the trees themselves bore witness to his internal struggle. Each creak of the old house, each rustle beyond the window, echoed the turmoil within, amplifying the tension that knotted his thoughts. Arthur's gaze drifted to the cracked mirror hanging in the hallway, a relic from another time, its surface marred by age. He avoided meeting his own reflection, reluctant to confront the man shaped by loss and shadow. Yet even in avoidance, the image lingered in his mind. A solitary figure, stooped and worn, eyes clouded with the weight of years and secrets. Was this the man he wanted to be? Could he still find the strength to change, to fight against the creeping darkness? The juxtaposition of fear and hope twisted through his mind, an uneasy dance that left him breathless. Fear of the unknown, of the dangers lurking beyond the forest's edge, mingled with a fragile hope sparked by Emma's presence and the wolf's quiet resilience. That hope was tentative, like the first fragile shoots of green pushing through frost-hardened soil, vulnerable, yet stubbornly alive. In the stillness, Arthur found himself wrestling with contradictions. A part of him longed to retreat further into the familiar shadows of his past, to shield himself from the pain of new battles and uncertain futures. Yet another part stirred with a fierce determination, a spark ignited by the wolf's silent plea and Emma's unwavering resolve. The old man realized that the line between protector and bystander had blurred beyond recognition. He could no longer stand on the sidelines. His hands clenched and unclenched, the rough skin a tactile anchor in the sea of uncertainty. The ache of loneliness pressed in, but beneath it, a yearning surfaced, a desire to reconnect, to reclaim a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. He thought of his children, scattered like leaves in the wind, their lives distant and unknowable. Had they ever truly understood him? Had he ever truly understood himself? The room seemed to breathe with him, shadows deepening as the fire's light waned. Arthur closed his eyes, surrendering to the quiet spiral of thought and feeling. Images flickered behind his eyelids, the wolf's wary eyes, the marks on the trees, Emma's determined gaze. They intertwined with memories of laughter and loss, hope and despair, weaving a tapestry of complexity that defied simple answers. A sudden pang of sorrow struck him, a raw, aching recognition of all that had been lost and all that remained at risk. The forest was no longer a distant backdrop, but a living testament to resilience and fragility alike. It held the stories of countless lives, human and wild, intertwined in ways Arthur was only beginning to comprehend. He rose slowly, the weight of years pressing against his joints, and moved toward the window. The first pale light of dawn was brushing the horizon, softening the edges of night's shadows. Outside, the world seemed poised between darkness and light, a fragile balance mirrored in his own heart. Arthur's fingers traced the cold glass, the chill grounding him in the present. The house was silent save for the distant call of a waking bird, a single note piercing the stillness like a fragile promise. In that moment, he felt the stirrings of something new, a tentative resolve that flickered alongside his doubts, a quiet courage born not of certainty, but of necessity. He turned away from the window, the room now bathed in the gentle glow of morning. The photograph still lay on the table, a silent reminder of love and loss, memory and hope. Arthur reached for it again, this time holding it with a steadier hand, as if drawing strength from the past to face the unknown. The old man settled back into his chair, the familiar creak comforting rather than confining. His breath slowed, the storm within easing just enough to allow a fragile stillness. The journey ahead was unclear, fraught with peril and pain, but for the first time in a long while, Arthur sensed that he was not alone in the darkness that surrounded him. The forest outside whispered its ancient secrets, the mist curling like silent fingers through the trees, and within Arthur, the quiet turning of the soul began, a subtle, profound shift that marked the end of innocence and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. He was a man transformed, no longer defined solely by loss and solitude, but by the fragile hope that even in the deepest shadows, light could find a way to grow. Arthur barely had time to steady himself by the window before an urgent knock shattered the fragile quiet of the morning. The sound echoed sharply through the empty house, brittle and insistent, like a warning clawing its way beneath his skin. He hesitated, heart hammering with sudden unease. No one came to his doorstep unannounced, not in this village, not in years, not since the silence had swallowed the place whole. The knock came again, more urgent this time, frantic almost. Arthur's breath caught. His fingers trembled as he moved away from the window and toward the door, each step weighted with a growing sense of dread. The forest outside had shifted overnight. The mist had thickened, folding in on itself, swallowing the edges of the world beyond his porch. The air felt charged, alive with something unseen and restless. The stillness of the night had been replaced by a tense expectation, a palpable pressure pressing inward. He opened the door cautiously, the hinges groaning softly like a weary sigh. Standing there was not a familiar face, but a stranger, a man in a dark jacket, his eyes sharp and unreadable beneath a brimmed hat pulled low. His breath puffed out in ragged clouds, and his gaze flickered past Arthur, as if searching for something or someone behind him. The wolf, perhaps. Or Emma. "Arthur." The voice was rough, edged with urgency and something colder, fear, suspicion, maybe anger. "We need to talk, now." Arthur's pulse quickened, a prickling heat crawling across his skin. "Who are you?" His voice was low, wary. The man's eyes narrowed. "Name's Callum. I'm with the local authorities. We've been monitoring the area, tracking the wolves, yes, but also other activities. You're involved now, whether you like it or not." "You know about the wolf, don't you?" Arthur's throat tightened. The weight of the man's words settled like a stone in his gut. "I'm just trying to help." Callum stepped forward, the tension in his posture unmistakable. "Helping? That's the problem. Your kind of help only makes things messier. You don't understand what's at stake." The old man's eyes flicked to the forest beyond, where shadows clung like dark stains. "And what exactly is at stake?" Callum's gaze hardened. "Control, balance, order. The wolves are part of an ecosystem, yes, but there are laws, rules. We can't have people running around interfering with what's meant to be managed." Arthur's heart pounded with a sudden fierce defiance. "Managed? You mean hunted, trapped, killed?" Callum's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence between them grew thick, oppressive, until a sharp crack split the air, a branch snapping violently nearby. Both men's heads snapped toward the sound, eyes searching the swirling mist. From the edge of the clearing, a figure stumbled into the weak morning light. Emma, breathless, eyes wild with alarm. "They're coming," she gasped, clutching something tightly in her hand. "The hunters. They're moving in." Arthur's body tensed, a surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. "Who?" "The ones behind the traps," Emma said, voice trembling. "I saw their trucks earlier, parked just beyond the ridge. They've got weapons. And they're not just after the wolves anymore." Callum's expression darkened. "That's why we're here, to contain the situation. You and your wolf are complicating things." Arthur's eyes blazed with anger. "Complicating? No. We're fighting for survival, for justice." Emma took a step forward, her voice rising with fierce urgency. "If we don't act now, they'll wipe out the entire pack. The wolf you're tending, it's the last of its kind in this forest. We can't let them win." Callum's gaze flicked between them, calculating. "You think you can stop it? You think you're heroes?" Arthur's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't know what I am anymore. But I do know that standing by and watching is no longer an option." The tension snapped taut, a wire stretched to breaking. Callum's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You're out of your depth, old man. This isn't a storybook, it's real life. And in real life, sacrifices have to be made." Arthur's breath hitched, anger and fear warring inside him. Sacrifices like killing the innocent. A flash of movement caught his eye, figures emerging from the mist, shadows coalescing into armed men advancing with deliberate steps. The hunters, their faces obscured by scarves and caps, eyes cold and merciless. The forest around them seemed to shrink, the trees closing in like walls of a cage. Emma grabbed Arthur's arm, her grip fierce and unyielding. "We don't have time. We need to move the wolf. Now." Arthur's gaze met Callum's one last time, a silent challenge, a fracture in the fragile truce. Callum's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then he nodded curtly. "Fine, but know this. If you cross the line, there will be consequences, and I won't hesitate." As the hunters drew closer, their footsteps crunching over frost-bitten leaves, Arthur felt the fragile world he had known crumble beneath him. The old rules, the quiet solitude, the measured distance from danger, it was all gone. In its place stood a raw, urgent reality where trust was scarce and every choice could tip the balance between life and death. He looked down at the wolf, its breathing shallow but steady, eyes flickering with a flicker of hope and fear. The creature was a symbol now, a fragile beacon in a gathering storm. And Arthur, once a man defined by loss and silence, felt the fire of resolve ignite within his chest. The clearing seemed to pulse with tension, the mist swirling like restless ghosts around their feet. The forest was no longer a haven, but a battleground, and the stakes had never been higher. Arthur swallowed hard, voice rough but steady. "We move. Together." Emma nodded, urgency sharpening her features. Callum hesitated, then stepped back, blending into the shadows as the hunters closed in like a pack of wolves themselves. The old man's heart hammered, every nerve alight with fear and determination. The fragile peace was shattered, the quiet night replaced by the roar of impending conflict. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and betrayal, and Arthur knew that nothing would ever be the same. As they slipped into the forest's embrace, the trees seeming to lean closer with watchful eyes, Arthur's mind raced with questions. Who could be trusted? What secrets remained hidden? And how far he was willing to go to protect the wounded wolf and the fragile hope it represented. The shadows lengthened, the mist thickened, and the forest whispered of reckoning. The old man's journey had crossed a threshold, and the night was alive with the promise of fracture. Something was coming, something that would break the silence forever. Arthur's fingers lingered on the wolf's coarse fur, an anchor in a storm of swirling doubts and mounting fears. The mist clung to the forest like a veil, thickening around them as the first steps of dawn struggled to pierce the lingering darkness. But beneath the fragile light, a shadow deeper than the morning chill settled over Arthur's heart. The old man's mind darted back to a detail he'd brushed aside earlier. The scratches on the sapling near the wolf, those jagged marks that felt too deliberate, too precise to be mere animal panic. He had traced them with trembling fingers, sensing a message woven into the bark's rough skin. Now the weight of that message pressed heavily against his memory. What if those marks were not just signs left by humans tracking the wolf, but something tied to him? Arthur's breath caught as a sudden fragment surfaced, a flash of years past, a memory long buried beneath grief and silence. He saw himself, younger, wandering these very woods, clutching a faded letter he'd never sent. The letter was addressed to a man named Callum. The name struck him like a cold blade. Callum, the man who had just stood on his porch, cold-eyed, warning him of consequences. Years ago, before the solitude took hold, Arthur had known Callum, not as an adversary but as a friend, a confidant. They had been close once, bound by shared ideals and whispered dreams of protecting the forest. But something had fractured their bond, a rift neither had dared to cross. Arthur's heart thudded painfully. The letter, he had written it in the wake of his wife's illness, a desperate plea for help, for understanding. In it, he had warned Callum of encroaching dangers, of shadowy figures who sought to exploit the forest's secrets for profit and power. But Callum had never responded. Or worse, he had chosen silence. A bitter knot tightened in Arthur's gut as he realized the truth. Callum was not merely an enforcer of rules or an agent of order. He was part of the machinery that had allowed the wolves to be hunted, the traps to be set, and the forest's fragile balance to tip into chaos. The man's presence on his doorstep was not coincidence, it was reckoning. The forest around them seemed to pulse with this revelation, the ancient trees bearing silent witness to betrayals long forgotten. Arthur's gaze shifted to Emma, her figure tense and resolute beside him. She was a bearer of truth and hope, but also a reminder of how intertwined their fates had become. The wolf, the fragile creature they sought to protect, was the axis upon which their fractured world now turned. Arthur's mind raced, piecing together a tapestry of half-remembered conversations and hidden glances. The village's silence, the elders' cryptic warnings, the cautious distance in neighbors' eyes, all threads woven into a pattern of complicity and fear. He had lived on the periphery of this web, unaware that his own past was entwined with the very forces now closing in. A sudden rustle behind the trees jolted him back to the present. Callum's voice cut through the mist, low and deliberate. "You think you can undo what's been set in motion? The forest isn't yours to save, Arthur. It belongs to those who understand its cost." Arthur's reply was a whisper, fierce despite his weariness. "Maybe I never understood, but I can't ignore what I've let happen. Not anymore." Callum's gaze hardened. "You've been a ghost in these woods, silent while everything fell apart. Now you want to play hero? It's too late. Emma stepped forward, voice steady, though her eyes flickered with unease. It's never too late to fight, for the wolves and for the forest, for what's right. Arthur's heart clenched as he watched the subtle exchange, the thin line between ally and adversary blurring under the weight of history and hidden truths. He realized that Emma, too, carried her own shadows. Her fierce determination masked scars he could only guess at, wounds born from battles fought in silence, sacrifices made without witness. The wolf stirred beneath his hand, a fragile breath escaping its lungs. In that moment, Arthur understood the depth of their shared burden. The creature was more than a symbol. It was a living testament to survival against odds stacked high with cruelty and neglect. Memories flooded back, his wife's gentle voice, the quiet vigils, the promises whispered in darkness. Those moments of tenderness had taught him that love and loss were often entwined, that hope could flicker, even in the coldest nights. Yet now, that hope felt fragile, threatened by forces both seen and unseen. Arthur's gaze drifted to a worn amulet hanging around his neck, a relic from his wife, a token he had never removed. The pendant bore the same symbol etched faintly into the bark near the wolf's hiding place. Her realization dawned with painful clarity. Those marks were not just warnings, but a call, a legacy passed down, linking past and present, binding Arthur's family to the fate of the forest in ways he had never understood. The forest's whispered secrets folded around him, thick with history and pain. The boundaries between protector and betrayer, friend and foe, blurred into shades of grey he could no longer ignore. Arthur's solitude had been shattered, replaced by a complex web of loyalty, betrayal, and fragile hope. He looked once more at Emma and then at Callum, the lines between them fractured and shifting like the mist that swirled at their feet. The old man's voice was steady, though layered with uncertainty and resolve. I don't know who I can trust anymore, but I do know this. The wolves, this forest, they are part of me. And I won't let the darkness claim them without a fight. Callum's eyes narrowed, a flicker of old regret, or was it warning, passing through his gaze. Emma's grip on her resolve tightened, her eyes reflecting both fear and fierce determination. The path ahead was tangled and treacherous, marked by shadows of the past and threats of the present. Arthur's journey was no longer just about survival. It was about reckoning, with history, with himself, and with the fragile bonds that might yet hold the key to salvation. As the mist thickened and the first pale light of dawn stretched across the horizon, the forest seemed to exhale, her breath held long and deep, waiting for the next move in a story far older and far darker than any of them had realized. Arthur's heart beat steady now, the storm within tempered by a newfound clarity. The old man who had once sought only solitude was now bound irrevocably to a fight that transcended time, a fight for truth, for justice, and for the fragile hope whispered beneath the ancient trees. Arthur sat alone in the dim confines of his cluttered living room, the fading embers in the hearth casting a weak, flickering light that trembled like a heartbeat against the gathering shadows. Outside, the restless forest murmured secrets through the cold wind, its breath weaving a fragile shroud that pressed in on the worn walls of the house. The room felt smaller than it had before, the weight of years and secrets crowding the air, thickening the silence until it was almost suffocating. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled as they wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the heat warping and shifting beneath his fingers. The bitter taste of old coffee lingered on his tongue, a dull reminder of sleepless nights spent wrestling with memories he could no longer escape. Each breath he drew felt shallow, as if the past was pressing down on his chest, constricting his lungs with invisible fingers. The photograph on the mantel caught his eye, his wife's smiling face frozen in time, radiant and untouched by the years or the shadows that had since settled over his life. For a moment, the warmth of that memory blossomed painfully within him, only to be extinguished by the cold realization that everything he had believed in was crumbling. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. The solitude he had clung to was a fragile illusion. The wolf, the secrets, the betrayals, they had shattered the world he thought he understood. His gaze drifted to the window, where the first pale light of dawn seeped hesitantly through the thinning mist. Outside, the trees stood like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching toward the grey sky. The clearing where the wolf had sought refuge was now a distant memory, swallowed by the shifting shadows and creeping fog. Arthur felt as if that place, and all it represented, was slipping through his fingers, dissolving into the cold morning air. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a soft creak from the floorboards behind him. He turned abruptly, heart hammering, to find Emma standing in the doorway, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion but burning with an unyielding fire. She carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, but tonight it seemed even heavier, as if the hope she had once carried was fraying at the edges. "I can't," she began, her voice breaking like a fragile thread. "I don't know if we're ready for what's coming." Arthur's throat tightened, the words echoing the turmoil inside him. "Ready," he whispered, voice raw and hoarse. "Emma, ready was left behind long ago. There is no going back." She stepped closer, hesitating before speaking again. "Callum's warnings, they're not empty threats. This isn't just about the wolves anymore. People will be hurt, and I'm scared, Arthur. Scared that we're stepping into something we can't control." The old man's eyes met hers, stormy and resolute. "Control, that was never ours to have. We're already caught in the middle, whether we like it or not." The room seemed to shrink around them, the silence folding in like a tightening noose. Neither spoke for a long moment, the weight of unspoken fears settling between them like a living thing. Arthur's mind raced, fragments of memories and half-truths swirling in a chaotic dance. He thought of the letter he'd never sent, the friendship with Callum that had fractured and faded into bitterness, the long years of quiet denial, and now, that past was no longer distant. It was a chain wrapped tight around his ankles, dragging him toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. He rose unsteadily, the floor creaking beneath his weight, and moved toward the window again. His reflection stared back at him, a man weathered and worn, eyes clouded with grief and resolve. The fragile hope that had flickered within him was now a burning ember, fierce and unrelenting. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the mist thickening as if to shield the coming storm. Arthur's fingers curled into fists at his sides, trembling not from weakness, but from the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He was no longer the solitary old man who had lived quietly on the edge of the woods. He was a guardian now, bound by duty and truth to a cause that demanded everything. "I can't lose him," he murmured, voice barely audible. "Not after everything." Emma reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent anchor in the swirling tempest. "We won't, but it means we have to be ready to face what comes. No matter the cost." Arthur swallowed hard, the words settling deep within him like a stone. The cost was no longer abstract. It was real, looming on the horizon like a shadow that would not be denied. The path ahead was narrow, treacherous, and there would be no turning back. His solitude was shattered, replaced by a fragile alliance forged in pain and necessity. He turned away from the window, the weight of decision pressing heavy on his shoulders. The room, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in with the echoes of a life unraveling. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside seemed amplified in the silence, a reminder that the world was shifting beneath his feet. Arthur's breath caught as a sudden memory pierced the fog, a moment long buried, the sight of Callum's face twisted in anger and betrayal, the words left unsaid, the friendship lost to time and regret. The past and present collided in a brutal reckoning, leaving him raw and exposed. He sank into his chair, head bowed, fingers trembling as they traced the worn fabric of the armrest. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant call of a crow, a lone cry that echoed the loneliness settling deep within his soul. "I'm scared," he confessed, voice fragile, "but I can't stand by anymore." Emma nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Neither can I," the fire sputtered, casting flickering shadows that danced like restless ghosts. The room seemed suspended between past and future, a fragile threshold where everything hung in balance. Arthur felt the line drawn before him, a divide between the life he'd known and the uncertain path ahead. He was standing at the edge of that abyss now, stripped of illusions and protections, raw in his vulnerability. The old man who had sought only silence was gone. In his place stood someone irrevocably changed, a man ready to face the darkness, though uncertain of what awaited beyond. Outside, the forest whispered its ancient secrets, the mist curling like silent fingers through the trees. Arthur's heart beat steady, each pulse a quiet promise that the fight was just beginning. The final confrontation loomed on the horizon, but for now, he sat in the fragile quiet, the calm before the storm, knowing that the line had been crossed. There was no turning back. Arthur stood by the cracked window, the cold glass a barrier between the fragile world inside and the encroaching shadows without. His breath fogged the pain as he stared out into the grey light of dawn, watching the mist curl and twist like spectral fingers reaching for something just beyond reach. The forest felt different now, charged, restless, as if it knew the balance had shifted irreparably. The weight of the past days pressed down on him, a relentless burden he could no longer shrug off. The wolf's fragile breaths, Emma's fierce determination, Callum's bitter warnings, all converged in a storm of doubt and resolve swirling deep within his chest. He had spent decades hiding behind silence and solitude, but that refuge had crumbled. Now, the truth clawed at him, raw and unyielding. A low creak pulled him from his reverie. Emma entered the room, her eyes shadowed but sharp, the exhaustion etched across her face only deepening the fire behind her gaze. She closed the door softly behind her, the sound final, like a seal closing on a chapter long left open. "We can't wait any longer, Arthur," she said, voice steady but edged with urgency. "The hunters are moving faster than we thought. Callum's men, they're tightening the circle. If we don't act, the wolf won't survive the night." Arthur's fingers clenched into fists at his sides. The old man's world, once so carefully contained, was unraveling with terrifying speed. Yet beneath the fear, a stubborn ember of defiance ignited. No longer would he be a passive witness to destruction. "I've made my choice," Arthur said quietly, the words heavy but resolute. "I'll face Callum. I'll confront the things I've avoided for too long. This ends with me, or it doesn't end at all." Emma's eyes flickered with something like hope, but also caution. "Confronting Callum? It's dangerous. He's not just an enforcer of rules. He's a man who's buried his own betrayals deep. You need to be ready for what you'll find." Arthur nodded, swallowing past the lump forming in his throat. The memories surged, echoes of a friendship fractured, the letter he'd never sent, the silence that followed. He could no longer deny the tangled web of loyalty and betrayal that had ensnared them all. If he was to protect the wolf, to protect the forest, he had to accept that legacy, painful as it was. "I'm ready," he said, voice firm despite the tremor beneath. "But not just to face Callum. I need to reach the village, the people. Silence has been our enemy as much as the hunters. It's time for truth, no matter the cost." Emma stepped closer, placing a steady hand on his arm. "That will change everything. There's no turning back." Arthur's gaze drifted to the worn amulet resting against his chest, the symbol etched into the bark, the link between past and present. It felt heavier now, a talisman not just of memory, but of responsibility. He lifted it slowly, fingers trembling, then let it fall back against his shirt. The room seemed to darken, shadows pooling in the corners like waiting watchers. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the horizon in a silent warning. Somewhere deep in the woods, a faint howl rose, piercing, raw, a call to arms that echoed inside Arthur's chest. He took a slow, steadying breath, the air filling his lungs like a promise. "We move at first light," he said, voice low but unwavering. "We bring the truth into the light. No more running, no more hiding." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line, resolve hardening. "Then we prepare. Because once the village wakes, there's no telling which side will stand or fall." Arthur stepped away from the window, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. The threshold between past and future yawned before him, dark and uncertain. But he would cross it, because some battles demanded sacrifice. Because silence was a luxury he could no longer afford. The old man's journey had reached its crucible. The fragile hope he carried was now a beacon, burning steady against the gathering storm. And as the first pale light of dawn bled into the room, Arthur knew one truth with unshakable clarity. The reckoning had begun. There was no turning back. Arthur sat heavily on the edge of his creaking wooden chair, the weight of the coming dawn pressing down like an unseen hand squeezing his chest. The room around him had shrunk over the hours, shadows pooling in corners and breathing with a life of their own. Outside, the wind had stilled, a suffocating hush blanketing the forest, as if the earth itself was holding its breath alongside him. Every creak of the old house, every distant snap of a twig, fractured the silence like a whispered warning. Emma stood near the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the dim light that filtered through grimy panes. Her eyes, dark and restless, flicked toward Arthur before darting back to the window, as if trying to pierce the thickening mist that cloaked the world beyond. The urgency in her stance was palpable, though her voice remained restrained, measured, careful, as if even a single word might shatter the fragile calm. Neither spoke. Words had become fragile things, brittle and laden with meaning beneath their surface. The air between them crackled with unspoken fears, old regrets tangled with fresh resolve. Their silence was dense, a barrier more potent than any lock or bolt on the door. It was a space where hope and dread danced uneasily, neither willing to claim dominion. Arthur's fingers traced the worn amulet hanging at his neck, cold metal against skin slick with sweat. The symbol etched there seemed to pulse faintly, a heartbeat in the stillness, tethering him to memories both painful and precious. The past and future collided in that small talisman, his wife's voice, the letter never sent, the fractured friendship with Callum, all swirling into a tempest of guilt and determination. He swallowed hard, the taste of old regrets bitter on his tongue. Outside, the forest loomed, a dark, silent sentinel. The trees stood motionless, their skeletal branches etched against the pale sky like accusing fingers. The mist coiled thickly around their trunks, swallowing any hint of movement, any promise of safety. Somewhere deep within the woods, unseen eyes watched, waiting. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second elongated into an eternity of dread and anticipation. A sudden creak from the floor jolted Arthur's attention. Emma's gaze snapped to the sound, her jaw tightening. The room's silence sharpened, brittle as glass. They both knew the hunters were near, waiting in the shadows, their presence a slow, creeping poison that tainted the air. The wolf's fragile breaths echoed in Arthur's mind, a haunting rhythm that underscored the fragility of all they fought to protect. Arthur rose unsteadily, pacing the worn floorboards with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall was a drumbeat of resistance against the tightening noose. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, heart hammering in a relentless cadence. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking until it felt like a cage trapping him within his own fears. Emma moved silently toward him, her hand reaching out but hesitating, an almost touch that spoke volumes of shared burden and tentative trust. Their eyes met, and in that charged glance lay 1,000 words left unsaid. Fear of what was to come, fury at what had been lost, and a fragile thread of hope that still dared to flicker. The clock on the mantel ticked with cruel precision, each second a countdown closer to the inevitable storm. Outside, the first faint cries of awakening birds cut through the stillness, but inside, time hung suspended. The night stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as if the world itself was bracing for a shattering. Arthur's voice finally broke the silence, low and trembling. "How long can we hold this? How long before the darkness breaks through?" Emma's reply was a whisper, almost lost beneath the weight of the moment. "Not long, but we stand. Because we have to." They returned to their places, two figures poised on the brink, hearts pounding, breaths held, souls tethered to a fragile hope that might yet be undone. The room exhaled a silence thick with tension, a quiet scream stilled just before the breaking. Outside, the forest waited, and so did the night. The door slammed with a thunderous crack that echoed through the tiny room, rattling the fragile glass of the window beside it. Arthur's hands, still trembling from exhaustion, clenched into fists at his sides. The sudden noise tore through the heavy silence, ripping open a wound he'd long tried to keep stitched shut. Emma stood frozen by the doorway, eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. But it was Callum who stepped inside, his face carved with cold fury and something raw, unspoken. "You lied to me," Callum spat, voice low but brutal, each word a blade slicing through the room. "For years you kept me in the dark. You let the wolves die while you hid behind your silence." Arthur's breath hitched, his throat constricting with the weight of a guilt that had haunted him like a shadow. "I didn't lie," he whispered, voice cracking. "I was scared. I didn't know how to fight anymore." "Scared?" Callum's laugh was bitter, venomous. "You abandoned everything we believed in. You let the forest rot while you drowned in your grief. And now you want to play the savior." Arthur's eyes burned with a sudden fire, the fragile mask of resignation shattering into shards. "I never stopped caring. I was just lost. But that doesn't mean I'm giving up now. Not while there's still a chance to make it right." Callum's gaze darkened, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles whitened. "You don't get to decide what's right anymore. That forest, those wolves, they're collateral damage in a war you never understood. You think your regrets can erase the damage." The room seemed to close in, the tension unbearable, pressing down like the weight of decades. Arthur's body shook, not from cold, but from the storm inside, the fury and heartbreak colliding in a desperate tempest. He took a staggering breath and let it out in a ragged sob, the sound raw and unguarded. "I loved her," he choked out, voice breaking. "My wife, and she was everything. And when she was gone, I lost myself. I thought silence was the only way to keep her memory alive. But all it did was let the darkness grow." Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "We can't undo the past, Arthur, but we can fight for the future. The wolves deserve that much." Callum's eyes flicked between them, conflicted shadows crossing his face for the briefest moment before hardening again. "You're both fools if you think hope is enough. The hunters won't stop. The village won't wake up until it's too late." Arthur's gaze dropped to the amulet hanging heavy against his chest, the same symbol etched into the bark near the wolf's refuge, a token of love and loss, memory and fight. With a sudden, furious motion, he ripped it free, the chain snapping sharply in the stillness. The pendant hit the floor with a hollow thud, rolling away as if to escape the weight it carried. "I'm done hiding behind memories," Arthur declared, voice rising. "This ends now. No more silence, no more running." Callum's jaw clenched, but he took a step back, the fight draining from his posture. "Then be ready to face the consequences. Because once the truth comes out, nothing will ever be the same." Arthur's chest heaved with a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, tears streaming freely now, carving clean paths down a face weathered by years of sorrow. The old man who had clung to solitude was gone. In his place stood someone reborn in the fire of reckoning, broken, yes, but unyielding. Emma moved to his side, her hand steady on his shoulder. Together, they faced the shattered remnants of the past, the fractured bonds, and the looming storm. Outside, the forest whispered its ancient secrets, the mist swirling like restless spirits. The line had been crossed, the fight had begun, and there was no turning back. Arthur stood at the edge of the forest, the morning sun filtering through the branches in soft, golden shards that danced across the frost-crusted ground. The mist that had once clung so heavily to the trees had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clear, yet the silence held a weight far heavier than the absence of sound. It was the quiet that follows a scream, the stillness after a storm, when the world seems to pause, not in peace but in reckoning. His hands, once trembling with doubt and grief, now rested steady at his sides. The rough leather of his coat bore the marks of nights spent wandering between shadows and light, between fear and fragile hope. The wolf, the wounded creature that had stirred something long buried in him, was gone, vanished into the forest's embrace. Arthur did not know if it had survived, but the absence was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, a testament to endurance beyond his own understanding. He thought back to the first night, when that faint, desperate whimper had shattered his solitude. How different the sound felt now, no longer a fragile plea lost in darkness, but a call that had awakened him from years of silence. The forest itself had spoken through that cry, revealing secrets and scars he had once tried to ignore. The stories whispered by village elders, the scratches on the sapling, the hidden camera, all threads woven into a tapestry of pain and resilience, betrayal and loyalty. Arthur's gaze fell upon the worn amulet hanging around his neck, now lighter without the weight of the chain. The symbol etched into its surface no longer felt like a chain binding him to his past, but a bridge connecting what was lost with what might still be saved. He remembered his wife's voice, soft, steady, a beacon in the darkness. He had thought his love was a refuge, but now he saw it as a seed in barren soil, fragile yet stubborn, pushing through frost to find light. The village lay quiet behind him, its secrets no longer safe in shadows. The fractures within it mirrored the fractures within himself. The silence of years was broken, not with triumphant shouts, but with the quiet courage to face what had been hidden. Arthur had lost much: innocence, solitude, the illusion of control. But he had found something unexpected in the fracture: connection, purpose, and a willingness to stand even when the path was uncertain. A breeze stirred the fallen leaves at his feet, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, a reminder that life endures in cycles of loss and renewal. Arthur breathed deeply, feeling the cold air settle inside him like a benediction. The forest had not forgiven, nor had it forgotten, but it had offered him a place, and not as a solitary ghost, but as a guardian bound to the wild and to the fragile hope whispered beneath the ancient trees. He took a slow step forward, the crunch of frost underfoot a steady rhythm in the unfolding day. The road ahead was uncharted, the dangers real, but Arthur's heart no longer wavered. The old man who had trembled at the edge of darkness had become something else, a bearer of light, not because the night was conquered, but because he had chosen to walk within it. As the forest exhaled around him, Arthur's voice broke the silence, low and steady. Some wounds never fully heal, but they teach us how to live with the scars, and sometimes that is enough. If you've walked this journey with Arthur, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in his place? If his story has moved you, please like and subscribe to the channel for more tales that explore the quiet courage found in the shadows. Together, we can find strength in stories, even those that don't end with neat answers, but with the enduring light of hope.